3 o'clock in the morning, the 8th of August, 1963, the British countryside is black and absolutely silent. A Royal Mail train cuts through the dark at speed 12 coaches long, carrying 72 postal workers who sort letters and parcels under lamplight as the train moves. In the second carriage, from the front, secured inside the high-value package compartment, sit 120 mail bags, each one stuffed with used banknotes. The total value, £2,595,997 sterling. In today's money, approximately 48 million pounds, approximately 8 billion United States dollars. A sum so large it required a special compartment, special handling, and the robbers believed total secrecy. The man at the controls is 58-year-old Jack Mills from Crewe, a railwayman of 2 decades experience. He has made this journey many times. He knows every signal, every bend, every stretch of the West Coast Main Line. And at a lonely stretch of track in Buckinghamshire called Sears Crossing, something is wrong. The signal ahead is red. Mills applies his brakes. The train slows. It stops on the deserted track. For a moment, nothing. Just the low hum of diesel engine D326 and the black of the English countryside. His fireman, 25-year-old David Whitby, climbs down from the cab to investigate. He walks to the signal box. He picks up the trackside telephone. The line is dead. He turns around, and out of the darkness, a man appears and tells him quietly, "Get back on the train." What Jack Mills and David Whitby do not know, what no one on board that train can possibly know, is that the red signal is a fabrication. A green light has been covered with a leather glove. A car battery has been wired to power the red. Everything about that signal is designed to deceive. And the Glasgow to London Royal Mail train has just stopped exactly where 16 men in helmets and ski masks needed it to stop. This is the Great Train Robbery. To understand what happened on that embankment in the early hours of August 8th, you have to understand what that train was and why it mattered. It was known as the Traveling Post Office, officially the UP Special. It had departed Glasgow Central Station at 6:50 in the evening of August 7th, bound for London Euston. Aboard, 12 coaches, 72 postal staff working through the night. These were ordinary workers sorting registered letters, parcels, and packages into different bags for different destinations as the train moved. The service was efficient precisely because it did not stop at certain stations. Mail bags were exchanged from the platform at reduced speed, the train barely pausing. The second carriage from the front was different. It was the high-value package carriage, the place where cash and high-value registered mail were sorted and secured. On most nights, the value of the cargo in that carriage would be around 300,000 pounds. Significant, but manageable. On the night of August 7th to 8th, 1963, however, it was carrying something far beyond the ordinary. The previous weekend had been a bank holiday in Scotland. That meant several days' worth of cash from banks across England, Scotland, and Wales had been consolidated into a single shipment, 663 high-value packets from different banks in different cities. The total that night, 2,595,997 pounds in used, untraceable banknotes. Jack Mills had boarded at Crewe, the Crewe changeover point for this route. He lived on Newdigate Street in Crewe with his wife Florence. He was a railwayman. That was his life, his routine, his identity. He had driven trains without incident for 20 years. He had no reason to imagine that this particular night would be anything other than another run south. He was wrong. The man who designed the plan that stopped Jack Mills's train was 41 years old in 1963 and had spent most of his adult life inside and around crime. Bruce Reynolds was born in London on the 7th of September 1931. His father worked at the Ford factory in Dagenham. Reynolds left school at 14, drifted immediately into petty crime, and by his early 20s had accumulated multiple convictions for theft and breaking and entering. By 1963, he had 11 prior convictions and was regarded by both his peers and Scotland Yard as one of the elite figures in London's organized criminal world. Reynolds was not a thug. He was a planner. A man who studied targets, assembled teams, rehearsed logistics, and thought several steps ahead. He drove an Aston Martin. He wore designer suits. He took his family to see Frank Sinatra perform in Las Vegas. His criminal associates called him Napoleon. His son Nick, who was barely 1 year old at the time of the robbery, would later say he grew up assuming his father was a spy, a man who modeled himself on the character Cary Grant played in To Catch a Thief. In early 1963, Reynolds began designing the most ambitious robbery in British history. The intelligence that made it possible came from a man whose identity remains unknown to this day. He was a senior security official within Royal Mail itself, a man with detailed knowledge of the money carried on the Glasgow to London overnight train. He passed that information through to two of Reynolds' most trusted associates, Gordon Goody and Buster Edwards, via a solicitor's clerk named Brian Field. The insider knew that on a specific night, a night when the Scottish bank holiday had boosted the cash cargo to extraordinary levels, the train would be carrying a fortune. Reynolds built his team carefully. He brought together Gordon Goody and Charlie Wilson, longtime associates. He reached out to another London criminal network, the South Coast Raiders men, who already had experience stopping trains. From within that group came Roger Corddry, a florist from Bournemouth by legitimate trade and a specialist in rigging railway signals by criminal practice. Corddry was the technical key. He knew exactly how to stop a moving train in darkness without triggering any alarm. The final crew stood at 16 men in total. Each had a specific role. Some would overpower the train crew, some would form the human chain to transfer the cargo, some would drive the getaway vehicles. And one, a retired train driver recruited by Ronnie Biggs, a man Reynolds had first met in prison, would take the controls of the locomotive and move it from Sears Crossing to Bridego Bridge, the designated transfer point. One of those 16 was Ronnie Biggs himself. Born the 8th of August, 1929, the robbery took place on his 34th birthday. He was, by the standards of this gang, a minor figure, a burglar with useful connections. He would later become the most famous person associated with this crime. Not because of what he did on the night, but because of everything he did afterward. Just after 3 in the morning on August 8th, the train passed through Leighton Buzzard at normal speed. Ahead at Sears Crossing, the signal was red. Mills braked, the train stopped. David Whitby descended from the cab. He found the trackside phone dead. He turned and a masked man stepped out of the dark and told him to get back on the train. Within moments, the cab door opened and men poured in. Jack Mills struggled. He grappled with one of them. He was struck from behind with an iron bar once, twice, 3 times, 4, 5 blows to the head. He slumped to the floor of the cab, semi-conscious, bleeding from 5 wounds. David Whitby was handcuffed to him. Now came the moment the plan had not fully accounted for. The retired driver that Ronnie Biggs had recruited climbed into the cab of locomotive D 326. He looked at the controls. This was a large, modern diesel locomotive, far more complex than the older trains he had experience with. He could not release the vacuum brakes. He could not move the train. And until the train moved the half-mile from Sears Crossing to Bridego Bridge, the getaway vehicles parked beneath the bridge were useless. The mail bags couldn't be unloaded on an open embankment. Everything depended on getting the locomotive to the bridge. So the gang turned to Jack Mills. Mills, 58 years old, with 5 head wounds and blood on his face, barely able to focus, was ordered to drive locomotive D 326 forward to Glasgow Bridge. He did it. Whatever combination of shock, pain, instinct, and pragmatism drove him to comply, he drove the train. It was the most painful half-mile in British railway history. At Glasgow Bridge, the operation became almost military in its efficiency. The first two carriages, including the high-value package carriage, had already been uncoupled from the rest of the train. Below the railway embankment, a waiting Austin truck and two Land Rovers were positioned for loading. The gang formed a human chain down the embankment slope. 120 mail sacks, 2.5 tons of used banknotes passed hand to hand from the carriage door down the human chain into the vehicles. The whole operation, from stopping the train to driving away, took under 15 minutes. Before leaving, one of the robbers walked back through the terrified postal workers in the remaining carriages and delivered a calm instruction: stay still for 30 minutes before contacting the police. It was designed to give the gang time to reach their hideout. It was also, as Detective Butler would later note, the clue that told investigators the gang had a base within 30 minutes of the scene. The vehicles moved off into the darkness. The train sat still on the track at Glasgow Bridge. Jack Mills and David Whitby remained in the cab. And in the mail carriers behind them, now empty 120 hooks where mail sacks had hung were bare. Leatherslade Farm sat 27 miles from Glasgow Bridge near the village of Brill in Buckinghamshire. The gang had secured it months in advance as their post-robbery base. By the morning of August 8th, the vehicles had arrived and the money was being sorted on the farmhouse floor. The total was divided 16 ways, approximately £150,000 per share. Then they played Monopoly. In a detail so extraordinary that it sounds invented, the gang sitting on one of the largest cash hauls in British criminal history played a board game with real stolen banknotes. And in doing so, they pressed their fingerprints onto a surface that police forensic teams would eventually examine in meticulous detail. The plan was to remain at Leatherslade for 2 to 3 weeks, allowing the initial intensity of the investigation to pass before dispersing. But the manhunt was immediately and overwhelmingly larger than they had anticipated. Within days, they began to leave. Before leaving, they had arranged for a team of hired workers to clean the farm and destroy all forensic evidence. Those workers, under pressure and perhaps in a state of panic, abandoned the job before it was finished. What they left behind was remarkable. Fingerprints on the Monopoly board, fingerprints on a ketchup bottle, fingerprints on the bathtub. Vehicles including the Austin truck and the Land Rovers hastily repainted yellow with the original colors still visible beneath the thin new coat. Sleeping bags, post office sacks, mail wrappers, food remnants, the physical archaeology of a crime that had not been properly buried. On the 13th of August, 1963, just 5 days after the robbery, a local herdsman noticed something unusual about Leatherslade Farm and reported it to police. 2 officers arrived. The farm was abandoned, but it was full. A sergeant and constable found themselves standing inside what was effectively the most significant crime scene in Britain since the Second World War. The gang was gone. Their fingerprints were not. On August 12th, 1,963 4 days after the robbery, Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler was appointed to lead the Metropolitan Police Flying Squad's investigation into the London connection of the case. He formed a 6-man train robbery squad the following day. Butler was one of the most distinctive detectives in British police history. A bachelor who lived with his mother in West London. A man who did not smoke, barely drank, and worked without interruption. Colleagues called him One Day Tommy because he almost never took a day off. He had risen from detective sergeant to chief superintendent in under a decade, a career trajectory that spoke to exceptional professional ability. He has spent years studying and pursuing London's organized criminal elite. He knew these men. According to sources who worked alongside him, Butler had identified 14 of the 16 gang members before any forensic evidence had been formally processed. The investigation proceeded on 2 tracks simultaneously: forensic analysis of the Leatherslade farm evidence and a network of informants who began providing names. A prison informant hoping for parole passed 18 names to senior investigators. A second informant, a woman, filled in the remaining gaps. The first arrest came not from Detective Butler's investigative work at all, but from an act of mundane carelessness. Roger Corddry, the signal specialist, the man who had rigged the lights at Sears Crossing, had found a landlord in Bournemouth. He had paid her rent in advance, 3 months' worth, in cash. She called the police. Officers found Corddry with stolen notes. He was arrested and became the key that unlocked the chain. Through Corddry's known associates and the forensic evidence flowing from Leatherslade, the arrests accumulated through late 1963. Gordon Goody, Charlie Wilson, Roy James, Brian Field, Tommy Wisby, Bob Welch, Jim Hussey, Ronald Biggs. The trial opened in 1964 at Aylesbury Crown Court. It lasted 51 days, one of the longest criminal trials in British history at that point. 613 exhibits were introduced, 240 witnesses testified. The jury was sequestered at Mentmore Towers to shield them from the unprecedented media pressure. Justice Edmund Davies presided. One by one, the verdicts fell. In April 1964, Justice Edmund Davies addressed the court before delivering his sentences. His words were precise, deliberate, and intended to be heard far beyond the walls of Aylesbury Crown Court. This is a crime which, in its impudence and enormity, is the first of its kind in this country. I propose to do all in my power to ensure that it is the last of its kind. Let us clear out of the way any romantic notions of daredevilry. The ringleaders received 30 years each. Others received 25. The total across all convicted men exceeded 300 years of imprisonment. Even at the time, some considered the sentences excessive. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner would later say publicly that he thought they went too far. But the judge had made his position clear. This was not heroism, this was violence, organized and premeditated, visited upon men who were simply doing their jobs. John Daly was acquitted. His counsel argued successfully that the only evidence against him, fingerprints on the Monopoly board, could be explained by a legitimate family game played months before the robbery. The judge agreed and directed a not guilty verdict. For Jack Mills, the verdicts meant very little. He was at home in Crewe, trying to recover from brain damage that would never fully resolve. He returned to work in May 1964, light duties only, unable to drive locomotives. He was on sick leave repeatedly in the following years. He retired at Christmas, 1967. He died in 1970, age 64. His family said he never recovered from what had been done to him. David Whitby went back to work as well. His sister Nancy later spoke publicly about what the night of August 8th had taken from him. My brother was 25 and had led a very sheltered life, she said. He was never the same after the robbery. He was so quiet, never the same. She believed he was terrified every time he returned to the railway. He died of a heart attack at 34. His family believed the robbery contributed to it. A locomotive at Crewe Station was eventually named Driver Jack Mills. A plaque for both Jack and David was unveiled. A politician stood on the platform and said something that needed to be said, and rarely was. Little did Jack and David know on that fateful night what lay in store for them. We talk about the Great Train Robbery. The great part of that is the role Jack and David played. The sentences were severe, but some of the men refused to serve them. Charlie Wilson went over the wall at Winson Green Prison in August 1964 with outside help. Ronnie Biggs escaped from Wandsworth Prison in July 1965 using a rope ladder, a waiting car, and a speed that surprised everyone who knew him as a minor figure in the gang. And Bruce Reynolds had never been caught at all. He was already living in Mexico with a false passport and his family. Reynolds moved through Mexico and Canada, living well initially. His share of the money lasted several years. His son Nick remembered a childhood of constant movement, of his mother and father being fashionably dressed and deeply in love, of flying from Mexico City to Las Vegas for a steak dinner or to watch Frank Sinatra perform. The money ran out. Reynolds returned to England in 1968. On November 9th, 1968, Tommy Butler arrested Bruce Reynolds at his mother's home in Torquay, Devon. The detective had pursued Reynolds for 5 years across continents. When Reynolds opened the door, Butler looked at him and said, "Hello, Bruce. It's been a long time." Reynolds, who had not entirely lost his sense of theater, replied, "C'est la vie." He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He served 10 and was released in 1978. Biggs proved far harder to catch. After escaping Wandsworth, he had plastic surgery in Paris, moved with his wife and children to Melbourne, then fled to Brazil in 1969 when Scotland Yard detectives closed in on him. In Rio de Janeiro, a Scotland Yard detective found him in 1974. But Brazil refused to extradite him. He had fathered a Brazilian child, and Brazilian law protected the parent of a Brazilian national from extradition. He became an international figure. He gave interviews. He appeared on television. He recorded a track. No one is innocent. With the Sex Pistols in 1978, becoming an unlikely icon of both criminal notoriety and British counterculture. In 1981, a group of former British soldiers kidnapped him in Rio and transported him by boat to Barbados, intending to hand him to British authorities. Barbados, it turned out, had no extradition treaty with Britain. Biggs flew back to Brazil a free man. He lived openly in Rio de Janeiro for 36 years, a fugitive who had somehow become a tourist attraction. In 2001, suffering the effects of several strokes and deteriorating health, he flew voluntarily to London and surrendered to police at Heathrow Airport. He was arrested immediately. He served additional time before being released on compassionate grounds in August 2009 by Justice Secretary Jack Straw. He died on December 18, 2013, in a care home in East Barnet, North London. He was 84. Bruce Reynolds died 3 months earlier. On February 28, 2013, aged 81, he died in his sleep. By the end of his life, he was living alone on state benefits in a small flat near Edgware Road, London. He had been jailed a second time in the 1980s for dealing amphetamines. He had worked briefly as a film consultant, published an autobiography, and lived long enough to watch his crime become legend. A family friend recalled that near the end, Reynolds had told him something: crime doesn't pay. The other members of the gang met endings equally devoid of glamour. Buster Edwards, widely believed by investigators to have been the man who struck the iron bar against Jack Mills' head, committed suicide in the 1990s. Charlie Wilson, who had escaped prison in 1964 and lived years abroad, was shot dead by a hitman in Spain. Brian Field, the solicitor's clerk who had brokered the introduction between the gang and its Royal Mail insider, died in a car crash together with his wife and children. The anonymous senior security official inside Royal Mail who had provided the intelligence, the man who made the entire plan possible, was never identified, never charged, and never caught. His name remains unknown. The money, £2,595,997, loaded by human chain into trucks in the dark in 15 minutes, was never recovered in any significant quantity. It is gone. The Great Train Robbery reshaped British security in ways that lasted for decades. Royal Mail overhauled its protocols for transporting high-value cash. Railway signal systems were reviewed and strengthened. The investigation established new procedures for the forensic handling of major crime scenes and for interagency coordination in large-scale organized crime cases. The trial at Aylesbury, 51 days, 613 exhibits, 240 witnesses, set legal precedents that influenced British criminal prosecution for a generation. The public response was more complicated. Many treated the robbers as folk heroes. The press gave them decades of coverage, their escapes, their adventures abroad, their memoirs, and music collaborations and film adaptations. Books were written, films were made. The 2013 BBC dramatization on the 50th anniversary drew millions of viewers. The robbery entered British cultural memory as a story of extraordinary daring. It has been called the heist of the century. Perhaps it was. But on the night of August 8, 1963, at Sears Crossing in Buckinghamshire, the heist of the century looked very different from the cab of locomotive D326. It looked like 15 men in ski masks pouring out of the dark. It looked like an iron bar. It looked like 5 blows to a 58-year-old man who had stopped his train because a red signal told him to. Jack Mills did everything right. He followed every rule. He stopped for the signal. He was taken from his cab, struck repeatedly on the head, forced to drive his own train forward with blood on his face, and left on a track in the dark with his hands shaking and his mind damaged in ways that would never fully heal. He returned to work. He drove nothing. He retired. He died at 64. David Whitby went home to Crewe and went quiet and died at 34. The nameplates at Crewe Station say their names. The locomotive says driver Jack Mills. The plaque says David Whitby. Two working men from Crewe remembered on a platform where hundreds of trains pass every day. Trains that stop when a red signal tells them to and move again when the signal clears. The signal at Sears Crossing in 1963 was a lie. Jack Mills stopped for it anyway, and what was done to him for stopping, for following the rules, for doing his job, is what this story is actually about. Not the money, not the Monopoly board, not the man who said, "Set Levada detective the door." Jack Mills, a railwayman, Crewe, 1905 to 1970. And he should never have been part of this at all.